Okay, welcome everybody. We've just hit 3 o'clock. I'm Phil Beatty. I'm the Chief Knowledge Officer at Times Higher Education. So almost a decade ago, a group of journal editors at a conference in San Francisco agreed that there was, quote, a pressing need to improve the ways in which research outputs are evaluated by funding agencies, by academic institutions, and a whole range of other parties. They issued a set of recommendations, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA. A big concern at the time was the use of the journal impact factor, to take an example. This was a metric used to help librarians identify which journals to buy, but it was increasingly becoming a proxy for quality used to judge the quality of university research and individual researchers' outputs. And sometimes even in redundancy processes, for example. So DORA said that when assessing research quality, funders and universities should consider the value and impact of all research outputs, including data sets and software. In addition to research publications, consider a broad range of impact measures, including qualitative indicators of research impact, such as influence on policy and practice. To date, almost 20,000 individuals and organizations from 145 countries have signed up to DORA, and there does seem to be real momentum, a broader drive to encourage and promote responsible research evaluation. But is there enough momentum? Clearly, some real challenges still remain. I've just been Googling Times Higher Education articles from the recent past. Here are some of the headlines from THE that followed from the DORA declaration. From January 2014, head denies rigging assessment thresholds in redundancy dispute. Dismissed lecturer claims appraisal metrics set at level to deliberately exclude him. I think he did lose his tribunal. Another from a different university in the UK the same year said simplistic redundancy metrics criticised. And even this year, just very recently from last month, Union condemns universities' rank and yank science cuts plan. The union said axing health and life science researchers with the least grant income and fewest citations is an error of judgment. Last week, THE reported industrial action was taking place at that university. So the use of controversial research metrics, particularly in assessing individuals' performance, is highly topical, highly controversial. But of course, robust data, carefully managed, has a wonderfully powerful, a vital, positive role to play in higher education. How can we understand performance, set strategy, develop benchmarks, share best practice without robust, solid performance data? How do we demonstrate to governments and stakeholders and the tax-paying public the great work that's coming out of universities, the powerful impact universities have, without this clear, comparable, robust data? University leaders, of course, need information, need measurements to manage and set strategy. And as an unapologetic university ranker, I've seen directly what accessible, comparable performance data on research outputs can do to support healthy competition, of course, to highlight pockets of excellence, to highlight rising institutions, rising departments, which can actually foster collaboration, can identify partners and future collaborators. And I've seen how vital research performance data is, not just for supporting institutional strategy, but for helping to inform and shape robust government policy. So I'm a huge fan of data, and I think it has extraordinary power. But of course, as we are in the era of accountability, in the era of data-driven decision-making, where data and the outcomes of data can have a really powerful reputational influence on institutions, there are all sorts of challenges and worries. The pressure to perform well across various metrics and rankings can intensify. There's concerns about manipulative self-citations, dodgy citation clubs, predatory journals, fake conferences, etc., etc. There's real concern that when metrics aren't applied correctly, if they're applied simplistically, or often sometimes deliberately, manipulatively, they can distort behavior, they can create perverse incentives, and they can harm people's careers. A few more headlines, and I promise we'll get onto the conversation. call to remove hyper-authored papers from research metrics. So we're seeing a changing research culture, which is challenging how we measure success. We must get beyond research management by numbers. That's from July this year. July last year, August last year. Foreign riches bankrolled binge on highly cited researchers. In October, citation gaming increasingly sophisticated. And from March this year, citations more important for earth scientists than real impact. And then we have the brave new world of future metrics, exciting new opportunities to understand performance. Another few headlines from this month alone, from Times Higher Education: using AI to assess researchers could improve transparency. And the creator of the Research Excellence Framework in the United Kingdom says we should swap expert panels for metrics in many fields. So we do have a metrics minefield to navigate. We need to navigate this safely. We need to harness the very best that the data has to offer, the data we have at our fingertips. We need to ensure we realize the fantastic positive potential of data. So I'm delighted that we have a fantastic expert panel to help us through the minefield. I'm absolutely thrilled that we're joined by Vivek Goel. He is the President Designate of the University of Waterloo and the Vice President for Research and Innovation at the University of Toronto. We have Max Liu, who's the President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Surrey here in the UK. Lydia Snova, she's the Director of Institutional Research at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of the leading institutional research specialists in the whole of the US. And we have Martin Shomshaw, he's the Director of the Institute for Scientific Information at Clarivate. Clarivate, of course, is the owner of the Web of Science and is sponsoring, supporting this incredibly important conversation today. So welcome to you all. We're going to address the question set out in the session description: what's wrong, what's best, what's new, what's missing, what's next. And of course, we'll have time for Q&A, so please do put your questions in the Q&A box. Upvote the ones that you like, and I'll try to get as many of them as I can. So first, perhaps, Max, I'll turn to you. I've set you the challenge of simply saying what's wrong. What do you think has gone wrong with metrics in terms of misuses? And then, of course, we'll move the conversation into good practice and best uses. But let's set the scene a little bit, if you would. Thank you.
I'm muting myself. Thank you very much, Phil, for your invitation. I'm very delighted to be here. So good afternoon, everyone. So particularly joining the distinguished panel. So on this topic of research metrics, the responsible use of research metrics, which is something I'm very passionate. So I'm here to participate in this discussion in my personal capacity. What's wrong? I guess the metric tide really has taken us to places where we all see problems that actually start to erode public confidence in research and the way we assess research and researchers. So I think first and foremost, we need to think this topic from the public trust and confidence in science and technology, because it is fundamental, because we need to maintain the trust and confidence. Nothing could exemplify any more urgent needs to do that than the current situation with vaccines and other treatment of pandemic of COVID. We need to, of course, at the outset, ensure the scientific rigor, data reliability, reproducibility of data, the integrity of the researcher's behavior, and then in terms of the research culture, a very diverse, inclusive culture. So that's the fundamental. But I'm pleased to say the tide of metrics now is turning to focus on the more appropriate and responsible use of data and metrics to inform but not to drive assessment. I think you alluded to some of the misuse and abuse of metrics early on in your opening remarks. I mean, typical one is the impact factor of a journal, and people take that as to equate that to to quality, which is very, very dangerous, and also to measure things that without a clear meaning, clear purpose, or not to take account of the subject variations or disciplinary nuances, or indicators actually used that is grossly inappropriate at the individual level, but it could be an indicator that is appropriate at a unit level or institutional level. For example, the national, we're talking about research, but I'm using the example of NSS, National Student Satisfaction Survey. If you apply that as individual level, it doesn't make any sense. Many of such examples actually does damage the individuals involved as researchers, and also actually damage the whole course of scientific research. I think we need to really look at the principles of the DORA, and also the guidelines that put out by many organizations, such as the UK Forum for Responsible Research Metrics, Leiden Index, Leiden, as well as Wellcome Trust, and many organizations around the world actually producing a set of guidelines that will really call for the robustness, transparency in the data, and to really engender diversity and more of the purpose or mission driven assessment rather than data driven. Data is very powerful, as you said, to inform the assessment, but that's not the end. The end is actually to look at how we're going to advance the research for societal contribution. So that's probably just a quick sort of intro to the topic. What's wrong and what are the issues that we should really pay attention, trying to get on the right track to really promulgate the principles of DORA.
Thank you, Max. That's really helpful, just to sort of set the scene there, and also to talk about some of the initiatives taking place. I'll come back to you, of course, but perhaps I could move swiftly towards the good practice, and maybe ask you, Vivek, to reflect as a university leader. Obviously at Toronto, you're in charge of the research policy. You're moving to Waterloo very shortly to be the president there. I'd love to get a sense from you, and also bring Max back in as well. What's good practice? What sort of things do you need to initiate so that you can get a real sense of the strategic direction of your university? You can support excellent research with data and avoid some of the pitfalls and challenges. So what's the best in terms of good practice?
Sure. So first of all, it's great to be here as well. It's a really important discussion that we're having together. I just want to build off of what Max said. I'm a health services and public health researcher, and I've worked with data all my life and looking at evaluating the quality of health systems, looking at the quality of individual clinical organizations. And as Max said, you can use data to shed light, but you can't actually, you can't say this cardiac surgeon's better than this cardiac surgeon on the basis of data alone. The ones that see the most difficult patients, the most advanced cases, may have the worst outcomes. So if you just look at the outcome data and say this surgeon has a higher mortality rate, you might miss the fact that they were seeing more severe patients to begin with, right? And we also know that socioeconomic status of the patients can affect their outcomes. There's so many other variables that go into it. So you can use that data to shed light on where to look, but then you also have to do more qualitative assessments. In terms of things like DORA, I absolutely agree with the principles there, but I would note that there's nothing new. At the University of Toronto, in the tenure process, written into our policies, which are 60, 70 years old, the committee that assesses the quality of the faculty members' research is called the Reading Committee. That's because they read, or they're supposed to, read the scholarship of the person under assessment. Now, having read thousands of tenure promotion files in my career, I know that we have files come forward in certain disciplines that say, we expect people to have one paper a year, at least in this set of journals. This person's met that threshold, ergo, they meet the bar. And the president will send the files back saying, no, you got to read the research. It's not just the quantitative metric, right? So we've had the processes for that type of assessment all along. And I would say the introduction of the quantitative metrics, the ability to do the type of work that Martin's company provides us with, has taken us off track and allowed us to maybe get a little bit lazy in doing assessments using the quantitative metrics. And as Max said, there's differences at the individual level, at the department or program level, and at the institutional level. And you can have biases in each one. And so we do need to use the metrics, but we need to use them, as you said, in a responsible way. That means understanding what the differences are. In astronomy and physics, with articles with hundreds of co-authors, you're going to have very different citation patterns than in humanities, where people are publishing a book every 3 or 4 years. So you got to understand those differences as you do the evaluations, whether it's at the individual level or at the program or institutional level. Some people say, well, once you get at the higher levels, things will average out. But an institution like MIT has a very different pattern of disciplines, or Waterloo, where I'm headed, compared to an institution like Harvard or Toronto. So you can't just compare institutions based on metrics alone without having some adjustment for those differences. And then as we look ahead, we're all talking about more collaborative work, more interdisciplinary work, more community engaged scholarship. We have to recognize that that type of work can require more time, more engagement with the community. And so just relying on quantitative metrics, for example, of output, without thinking through the type of work that someone as an individual or an organization might be engaged in. Just looking ahead, I think there's some really interesting things coming along to get at some of those kinds of impacts. And you cited some of those with the headline, so I won't belabor them. But one thing that I think we really need to start to work on is, just as we've developed the bibliometric databases that allow us to track how a piece of research gets cited, gets used, and so on, can we start to look at how can we track how the research flows through society in other ways? So we have things like patent citations, so we can look at the impact of research in commercialization and so on through some of those types of tools, and the quality of that data is starting to really improve. But can we look at, for example, again, in my area, if research is cited in clinical practice guidelines, and there are now databases of clinical practice guidelines globally. The Cochrane collaboration looks at evidence syntheses and so on. Can we start to mine the citations in those sorts of sources to look at how research is being used in other ways? Many governments have processes where briefing notes are being put together for cabinet. They're supposed to list the research that's being cited, or that's been relied on in developing that. So can we, now sometimes that's protected by cabinet confidentiality or so on. But 30 years ago, we said we couldn't do some of the things that we now take for granted. And so we could start to work on that. A few final points. Equity, diversity, inclusion, big issue globally. Again, the pandemic revealed, very quickly with, again, some of the data that came out from Bibliometrics, that women were publishing less during the time of COVID than men were. But we also need to recognize that, the representation in disciplines can vary. So I gave the examples of physics, astronomy as disciplines that have high rates of publication with lots of co-authorship, but we know women have been underrepresented traditionally in those disciplines. And so as we look at quantitative metrics, We need to think about the equity considerations as well. We also need to think about the fact that some of the types of scholarship that people from some of these traditionally underrepresented communities might engage in, Black scholars, Indigenous scholars, might be the kinds of scholarship I described earlier that requires more time, more work to get the community involved. And so just using quantitative metrics that we've gotten used to, even if we validate them and say they're okay for this kind of use, we need to be very careful as we look ahead. And then the final point I'll just say is, because the question that said, what's the role of university leaders, administrators? I think if we look at what our institutions are doing, our policies, it's all there, as I said. And sometimes it predates the introduction of these quantitative metrics. The decisions about judging scholarship happen at the peer level. It's in those appointment and tenure committees. It's in grant review panels. It's in the journal reviewers, right? And so the culture change that has to be brought about is not just in terms of university leadership. It's going to be throughout our communities, and it's conversations such as this that are absolutely critical. And my final observation would be the ranking organizations have to come along with us on this.
Thank you, Vivek. And of course, I'm not shirking responsibility as a ranker. I know there's some questions coming in about rankings as well, which we'll of course address. Perhaps there's lots to chew on there, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Martin in a moment about some of the things that the actual bibliometrics and data companies are doing in terms of responding to different needs around normalization, around impact, etc. Some of the biases and data that we've seen. But perhaps I can stay with you and Max for a moment or two more, just to talk about that culture shift that's necessary. You mentioned that maybe universities have become a bit lazy by over relying on metrics. I want to talk a little bit more about the individual scholar, in the sense of, do we feel, perhaps Max, I can go back to you, do you feel we over measure individual scholars? There's lots of conversations about the system being so determined by the next paper. Do you think we need to sort of sit back a bit and really reflect on some of the ways we understand performance at the individual level?
Yeah, thank you, Phil. I'd just like to add a few points, build on the great contribution by Vivek. We all know that traditionally scholarship is assessed by peer review. I mean, that's in terms of the publication, it's still the practice, common practice. But it is, I think, the misuse or the tide of metrics coming into management of in higher education that actually changed. I mean, people become lazy, as described by Vivek. But I think fundamentally, all these things that in our system, not picking the ranking. Ranking is one of the issues that actually cause the focus on data metrics. But we all know a single matrix is very reductive and too narrow, is not meaningful. So that's why we're seeing a trend. Now we're going to look at more nuanced, holistic assessment of scholarship, more in terms of what contribution they make to the scholarship of the field to society. In that way, I actually quite pleased to see some of the rankings, like the THE impact ranking. You look at the translation from knowledge, be it teaching of the knowledge as well research, creating new knowledge, how that impact on the UN SDGs. I mean, that's fantastic. But locally, I think at the university, I mean, through my career, I have been sitting on many promotion and appointments committees. We do peer review, only use data or metrics as a supplementary and a supportive tool. But also, we have to really recognize in the creative arts areas, there's no metrics that you can use. You just have to assess on the pure scholarly contribution or the outputs in a creative form. So that's the nuance, I guess. I think another point, just last point, Phil, I think we have to really increase, if we do use, even we use it as a supportive tool, we have to engage with the whole research community to say that, okay, here's the data source, they are robust, they are credible, but you should also verify them. So that's the transparency of the data. I think everyone, if they know how the data and metrics is used or not used in the context of the purpose, whether it's appointment or redundancy or anything else, but not actually driving the decision making, is informing, shedding light, in the process. I think that in that case, everyone would accept.
Thank you, Max. It's the dog wagging the tail rather than the tail wagging the dog when it comes to metrics, of course. And I think that's one of the areas where rankings has become problematic, in the sense that there's a tendency for some institutions to potentially just chase the ranking metrics beyond their own missions, which is a real issue that we need to deal with. Lydia, I'm looking forward to turning to you soon, but perhaps for this next section, we should talk to Martin. There's a lot of meat to get into there, Martin, but I want you to really focus on what's new. How are the tools evolving? How are organizations like Clarivate responding to some of the changing needs of the sector and some of the challenges there? Can you perhaps give us a bit of a sense what's new in the field of bibliometrics and the wider research evaluation community?
Thanks very much, Phil, and thanks to everyone for joining today. I think the agenda we have at the Web of Science and within the ISI is aptly summarized in a recent report we did called Profiles, Not Metrics. And in this report, we draw attention to the information that's lost when data are kind of squeezed into simplified metrics or league tables. So therefore, our aim is really to kind of try and develop our products in ways that enable the users to engage more actively with the data, so that they can understand what makes the metric and to relate it to other kind of relevant benchmarks, so like a national average or category normalized citation impact. And crucially, this process should lead the user to question their interpretation of the data more deeply. And like Max mentioned, the kind of origin of the use of bibliometrics and to support research assessment, I think is very interesting, because it's the kind of idea that you might formulate an opinion about the performance of a group or an individual based on a range of different indicators or reading their research. And then you can look at the bibliometrics, and the bibliometrics might confirm that, and that might reassure you, and it might make you more comfortable with the opinion that you've come to. But it may contradict what you've arrived at, and then therefore make you question your original assessment against the data. And it may be that the data needs to be interpreted in a particular way because of the way the field or discipline works, or because it's based on local research or in the social sciences or the arts and humanities, for example. So in terms of kind of steering the development and use of metrics to this more engagement, I think there's a good example. We recently added these new feature to the Web of Science called author impact beam plots that break down a publication and citation impact of an individual in an accessible visualization. And when you start to sort of utilize the data and see, looking at particular individuals, how things ebb and flow, it sort of entices you to think, well, what actually caused that? And consider the factors that may have affected that sort of citation performance or publication volume. And that might be, where they were working at the time, the type of job role, what was the collaboration opportunities they had, or the funding, or all these other range of factors that you really want to bring into the assessment. So, we're trying to kind of complement the the movement towards more responsible use of metrics by enabling people to get into the data like that. And it's similarly true for institutional or regional analysis too. We want to develop the analytical tools in that way. And our perspective in the ISI is really not to try and add more and more metrics to bring in more and more complexity into the algorithms, possibly under the guise that a particular weighting schema is better than another. We kind of have to accept that there are limitations to what you can do with citation analysis, and focus on understanding what those limitations are, and how to adjust our interpretation accordingly. We've been looking at this quite a lot recently in terms of how the system is changing overall in the global nature of science, especially with increasing international collaboration, and the development of science in the emerging research economies. And these trends lead us to question actually what is our measurement of good? What does that mean? And how do we have to change that in terms of this changing behavior? So one example is, it's widely known that internationally collaborative papers tend to get more citations. And in a badly conceived system, this might lead researchers to seek out international partners in order to gain a citation boost, which of course is not an intentional outcome. We want people to seek out collaboration to carry out better research. So again, it's about what features can we add into the way the metrics are presented that enable people to do that. So for example, compare institutions' domestic research against other domestic research, or internationally collaborative research, or that which has large multi-authorship. To try and compare like with like. And I think, in terms of looking into the future, we have become rather fixated on the use of a citation as this unidimensional measuring instrument. We're just trying to assess some broad sense of performance, where in fact the network itself can really be exploited to understand how the research is evolving, and to help us appreciate the novel ways in which research is utilized. And I hope in the future that better use of science mapping and research landscapes will help us in figuring out, it's not just about citations, but this is a paper which underpinned research as it was applied in a new area, in engineering and material science and artificial intelligence and so forth. And that it also extends, I think, out into the larger goals, for example, how we relate research to UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is a topic that comes up a lot. And I just wanted to say one sort of final thing. Of course, all this work relies on us building trustworthy data sources, and that's becoming increasingly difficult as more and more people are sort of seeking to undermine the system to gain an advantage. It says in DORA that organizations that supply metrics must be clear on that inappropriate manipulation of metrics will not be tolerated, be explicit about what constitutes inappropriate manipulation, and what measures will be taken to combat this. And this is not really a straightforward problem to solve. We're engaged in this in a number of different fronts. The range of and ingenuity of tactics used is getting even more complex. And I think the assumption that the responsibility for this lies, for example, with data suppliers is possibly a dangerous one, because you might end up sleepwalking into a situation, or one of two situations perhaps, which is one, the rules of engagement have been set by a minority group, even though the impact of those rules would affect everybody, or two, that you're completely passive and you do nothing, and the credibility of the data is undermined completely. And that's also a worry. And we want to try and get into this middle ground where we work together. So, such as how we present the metrics, how can we do that in a way to support the agendas for responsibility, and how can we collectively understand what it means to engage with that kind of data responsibly, not responsibly, fairly, and without some kind of nefarious intent.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks. Yeah, some interesting conversations about the policing of malpractice and how we collectively tackle that, which we'll come to. But I think it's important we turn to Lydia. There's lots and lots of questions coming through as well, so we'll move to questions and open discussion in a moment. But Lydia, I sort of challenged you with the what's next piece, really, in terms of, you know, you are responsible for institutional research for one of the greatest universities in the world. Your data, your analysis, you know, massively informs the strategy of MIT. What sort of metrics do you use? But more importantly, what would you like to see? How would you like to see the space evolve? What's missing? What's your sort of fantasy of future opportunities for institutional research, particularly around research outputs and the evaluation of research excellence?
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks, Phil, for inviting me. And I do admit that being at MIT puts us in a different kind of situation than most other universities. We have different kinds of things that we worry about. As an American university, I'm sure you're aware that we tend to raise the money to support the research, and it's not one big grant. It's 5,000, 6,000 different projects going on at once. So about 10 years ago, the chairman of our corporation, who had been chairman of Citibank, came to us and wanted some help in trying to talk about what MIT does and what MIT, what's that, the result of all the work that we do. And he wanted to think about broad topics that he could talk with donors and the public. So we embarked on a project where we were looking at what are the outputs, what can we claim as the results of our work. And this is a lot different than the kind of metrics we've been talking about. So first of all, he wanted to talk about broad topics like sustainability, like life sciences, and then specifically within those, like diseases in the life sciences, or the, you know, batteries and energy, that kind of thing. And then he wanted to know who was working on these topics. And then after figuring out who's working on, what did they produce? So we used a lot of natural language processing. I think the natural language processing is an important part of the future of data at a place like MIT, understanding what's happening. And you do have to simplify it, right? Because into broad categories. So we used that to come up with topics. And then we identified the people that were working on them. And then we had to identify the outputs that are important to MIT and probably important to all of us. So for instance, we looked at life sciences. And one thing we found when we were looking at this is there were more electrical engineers and computer scientists working in life sciences than there were biologists at MIT. And that there was also people in urban studies and architecture, political science, economics. They all were coming at the same topics from a different direction, but they were contributing to the generalized knowledge of these areas. So typically at a place like MIT and most American universities, we judge part of our success on the basis of how much money we have, how much research funding we had. But John Reed, who was the chairman, said, well, that's not really an output. He's a banker. He was thinking in different terms. And he says, that's really an input. What are the real outputs? So of course, with outputs are the intellectual property that we generate, publications, citations, patents. We also have been looking for years at the issue of our effect on the economy with startup companies. How many companies are started? How many people do they employ? How much do they generate? And of course, the most important output from MIT is, of course, our students, the people that graduate from MIT. So the tools are still the same. Really, we're looking at bibliometrics, but rather than looking at worrying about the citations and numbers, we're trying to look at the collaborations. Who's publishing with who? Who's doing research with who? And then, and what are they producing? We've been spending a lot of time trying to do that. The hardest part is, of course, the outcomes. of what happens to MIT students. And so we're finding that this is a place where we're having to build big data systems. It used to be we relied on our alumni association to tell us what was happening to our graduates, but we found more and more that we have to use third parties to go out and find this data. And so I think that's one of the pieces of data that's very important to higher education. Who are we doing and what are they doing? You know, are they founding companies? And we also stopped looking at just at money, the economics of it. We started looking at things like, are they founding nonprofits? Are they working in that area at all? In terms of intellectual property and patents and founding companies, the other thing we're looking at is the gender differences. We have a group of people led by our former president, Susan Hockfield, who's working with a venture capitalist to look at why aren't women founding companies? Why, you know, and they did an analysis. Professor Murray, Fiona Murray from our Sloan School, she found if women were starting companies in the same rate that men were, we'd have 40 more companies founded just by MIT faculty. So there's 40 missing companies that could have hired people, generated income, that kind of thing. So that's become really important for us. And also building this kind of this database of alumni and keeping it current. You can do it once, you can do it once, but then you have to do it year after year after year. And how do you do that? And also building up our collaborations. We do a lot of initiatives at MIT, and we found that this using the natural language processing to find people at MIT that are working on the same kind of areas is important. And so I think that's one of the tools. You know, in terms of other things, we do value the reputational data that we get from places like Times Higher Ed, and because that's one thing we can't generate on our own at all. And then I think the future of what we're doing in terms of how MIT is approaching things really depends on having a better grasp on what the outputs are. And again, we're not thinking so much of publications and citations as we are on the effect on the economy, the effect of our graduates on changes in society, what they do, and in the future. And so I think that's from the institutional point of view.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Lydia. We'll move to questions really in terms of exploring where we go from here. But I just wondered, there was a particular issue that sort of crept up a bit during the conversations, which I'd love people's thoughts on, partly because we at Times Higher Education are struggling with it ourselves, which is the rise of sort of kilo-authored papers, as we call them, the rise of these huge research collaborations with thousands of co-authors. You know, we're seeing it very much, of course, at CERN in physics, but we're absolutely seeing that as well in health, Vivek. The rise of these mass collaborations, which are brilliant for science, but incredibly challenging to attribute attribute credit. So I'd go to Martin for a technical answer, but Max, do you want to come in on that? And how do we embrace that and accept that, but also deal with the idea around attribution and credit and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think as Lydia alluded to, I think collaboration in this sort of areas is probably more important. Collaboration and the output and the impact of the work is more important than measuring, because this comes down to what, you know, what's the purpose? You know, we should only measure things when it matters, right? So I guess, you know, what matters in those kind of area, whether it's astronomy or genomics kind of work, I think everyone should get the credit, and those co-authors should all get the credit for what the impact the work will be.
Thanks. Vivek, do you have a thought on that? And then I'll turn to Martin for the sort of technical solution to these sorts of things around, fractional
I agree
counting.
with that. And the reality is the areas in which we're having sort of really large groups, like if you look at what it takes to build out the Large Hadron Collider, 30 years of work, thousands of scientists go into designing the one experiment that finds a particular particle or so on. So it's not surprising. So if you think of the input-output ratios, it's not surprising that so many authors there. So I think, Martin will probably have some of the technical answers. We need to just ensure that we correct for these sorts of things and again, the biases that might be inherent. And even when you're comparing physics departments, right? One that has more theoretical physicists will have less people on these types of big papers than one that has more particle physics physicists. So it's just something that we have to be aware of. And we, as you noted, we have to also be aware of the evolution in disciplines. So larger clinical trials means that there's going to be larger teams of people involved in being able to generate the patient samples that are required, just as an example.
Thank you. Martin, do you want to come in on some of the sort of technical ways you're handling the changing, you mentioned obviously the shifting patterns of international collaboration, but particularly around this sort of multi-author paper situation?
Yeah, it's a very tricky situation. I mean, our current advice is if you're doing institutional benchmarking is that you should exclude those sorts of papers in order to make sure you're measuring other comparable things. And that if you, the intent of your analysis is to look at that specific field or discipline, then you need to treat that data very with a special regard. Yeah, a lot of people will come to the idea of fractionation and division of credit based on the number of authors using some kind of schema. But yes, that kind of leads to issues, particularly when you're comparing a theoretical physics to a high energy physics or astronomy, because whether or not you do or don't have those sorts of papers, influences how the metrics work for you. So yeah, we're unlikely to see a one size fits all solution for that. I think also worth noting is that we did some analysis recently on that, and initially I went into that on the with the impression that high energy physics was where all this stuff was happening, and that's true, but the global health network is the area now where we're seeing the most growth in that sort of things, and that may be not actually related to the number of authors, but it's the number of countries that are participating. So you often think about papers from CERN with 3,000 authors on. Mostly they're coming from Europe and North America. These kind of global epidemiology studies have 150 plus countries represented on there, and that actually in itself is another different problem that you have to encounter. And we've actually proposed recently in a paper another way, instead of doing fractionation, that you can effectively benchmark those papers to other similar papers. So you say, okay, well, all the papers that are domestically co-authored, they get normalized in one way. If they're internationally collaborative in bilateral or trilateral ways, well, they're largely comparable. And if they're in this other set, then that you want to compare those to each other. So I think there might be a few options to explore about how we deal with that.
Thanks. We're coming into the last sort of 12, 13 minutes or so. So I'm going to do some rapid fire audience questions. So I'll whiz through them quickly. If you can respond, if you really want to, and as briefly as possible, I'll fire them out at the panel. Elizabeth Gadd has asked, well, she said, Max Liu talks about the need for metrics to be mission specific, but the rankings are not. What can rankings do to be more sensitive to institutional mission? From my perspective as a ranker, I think we're doing that through another aspect that people find rather frustrating, which is the proliferation of different kinds of rankings. We're absolutely creating the world rankings for global research universities. We've created the impact rankings for all institutions who want to demonstrate social and economic impact framed by the Sustainable Development Goals. We have teaching rankings. Of course, we have loads of filters for emerging economies, for different regions. And absolutely, we are encouraging the disaggregation of data, the breaking down of data as much as possible. We actually move quite quickly from the ranking. We recognize how inherently crude it is to give each institution, large multifaceted institutions, a single composite score. So we encourage the breaking down of those scores into areas. And of course, when we work with universities, we produce quite complex, detailed profiles. Does anyone else want to come into that, the idea of making sure that rankers are more aware of institutional mission? Any thoughts from the group?
Well, I think that actually the subject rankings provide a lot of benefit because they're much more aligned with what the institutions are doing. You can compare yourself in those areas with other institutions, and I've found the faculty themselves value those in ways that they don't value the overall rankings.
Yeah, I think the apology to the sector is more rankings are probably coming, and that's possibly a good thing because it democratizes rankings. It means there is no single correct answer. Max, did you want to come in as well? Did you?
I think the closest is the impact ranking, right? So you measure the impact of teaching, research, outreach, and stewardship of a whole set of activities the universities do, and then through their partners and how they would actually impact on society through the UN SDGs. But I agree with Lydia. I think the subject rankings actually more aligned with institution mission. Anything that is reduced to a single number, and that can be misused. I'm not saying that they are sort of inappropriate ranking, but if you just use a single number, then it'd be sometimes you have the unintended consequences in management decision making, for example.
Sure. This one might be, it's sort of for me as a ranker, but actually I'll go to Martin as well, and I'd love to have Vivek's views as well. The bibliometric sources that are used by rankings are biased towards the global north. The publishers, the editors, the peer reviewers tend to be in the global north. I think that the pandemic has shown us beyond doubt how important it is that we collaborate north, south, east, west, that we share the grand challenges of the world. Martin, can I ask you a little bit about what your thinking is in terms of broadening the bibliometric sources, the journal sources, to be more inclusive, to be much more aware of the global south? And then maybe Vivek, just from a leadership perspective, what can we do to support the visibility of great scholarship in other parts of the world that are perhaps excluded from some of the conferences, some of the mainstream global journals? Martin, how about you first?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think the trajectory of how we're growing the Web of Science database is to become more inclusive. I think a lot of people still think about it as being this kind of very selective set of journals. Oh, it's about 10,000 journals in there, and that's a lot's changed in the last 10 years. I think currently we index about 22,000 journals in the core collection, and the only sort of barrier to getting in there is the basic quality criteria, and I think these are really essential in order to produce the trustworthy database, in terms of the metadata that's collected, that there are original research articles, that there's peer review, there's the usual proper processes in place, and we're continually growing the collection, hundreds of new journals every year, and we'll continue to do that. That there is a kind of flip side, I think, you have to consider, which is there is a database to support discovery, and that can be very inclusive in terms of the diverse disciplines in there and the range of sources and locations. In terms of how that data are used in a bibliometric analysis, there's still quite a lot of debate about how appropriate that is. So you can look to, for example, the Leiden ranking, use even a subset of the flagship journals from the Web of Science, because by their definition, they want to compare journals that have a similar sort of pattern of international co-authorship, because they believe that gives them a comparable citation behavior. So if we go into different subject areas with more kind of regional focus, particularly in the social sciences and certainly in the arts and humanities, it may not be true that citation data are appropriate for this kind of analysis. So we have to consider both of those things at the same time.
Thank you. Vivek, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'll just build on that very quickly to say that it goes back to, we need to start to think more broadly in the types of scholarship that's being done and the outputs that it has. Lydia talked about looking at the impacts in other ways. And the impact of alumni is, we could really, I think we'd all agree that it's the impact of our alumni that's probably the most important impact of our institutions, even of the research, because as the students learn from research professors, they're carrying that out into whatever they do. And so as we think about universities around the world, not all of them have that same mission. Not all of them are conducting the type of research where they're sending people off to CERN to work on the particle physics. And so to just take those metrics that we've developed over the years based on that type of scholarship, I'm not sure adding more data into it is necessarily going to solve it. We should absolutely do what Martin's describing, looking at bringing in journals from different languages and so on. But I think we also need to think more broadly in what we mean by impact and what we're trying to measure, and then create the databases to address that.
Thank you. I'm just going to, we're really getting short of time. There's so many questions. I'm just going to try and fire a few more. Lydia, Sarolta Mohin Palfi, forgive my pronunciation of your name. Question, what are your experiences? She's praising you very highly before, but I'm cutting to the chase. What are your experiences regarding the internal university data quality, open data repositories, or internet/social media crawling and scraping to acquire good quality data? What's MIT doing around the altmetrics, understanding social media? Is that an absolute minefield for you? Is that something that's a rich vein of sentiment data, for example?
Well, I think we've looked at that a little bit, but it's very difficult to try and figure out how it would be used internally in terms of thinking about the mission of MIT and how it contributes to that. So I have to admit, we looked at it, we haven't really figured out a way to bring it in and use it in a productive way. I'm sure that we will in the future. But we're just very lucky that we have the richness of what the faculty are doing now, what the researchers are doing now, that we haven't really had to go beyond that.
Be fascinating to see how AI might actually extract more information around impact through social media, through mainstream media. That's really interesting. Vivek, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just to give an example, our School of Graduate Studies did a 10,000 PhD study. They hired a number of summer students to sit there, look people up on Facebook, LinkedIn, PitchBook. And, we're able to generate data on almost 90% of the graduates over a 10-year period and find out where they're working, that they found that, or they were with a startup and so on. So, and that took a little bit of work, but as you're saying, I think some of those things could start to get automated. And again, some of those firms have data that could be used for this type of work.
Thanks. Quick one, possibly for Martin. Neve Brennan, just referring to the challenges around bibliometrics in the arts and humanities. Books, book chapters often excluded, Anglophone bias to a large extent, global North bias. What are the sort of responses that companies like Clarivate are making to trying to understand arts and humanities better, where journal articles aren't the main driver of outputs?
Yeah, certainly we want to look at books, and I think there's been quite an increase in the number of kind of open access publishing models now that are really going to help us get visibility of that kind of content. And that's, I think, the challenge in that area is we are overwhelmed with the number of possible things that we might want to put in the database, and there's a capacity to do a certain amount in order to make the data sufficient quality and do all of those things. It's not as straightforward as journals. You can much more readily identify the high quality journals, and you can and find them out. So I think there's more that will be available to us in terms of data and open access that might actually help us improve some of these things, because I appreciate the coverage has got a long way to go in order to meet some of the requirements for evaluation that might need to be done.
Thank you. We've probably got about 60 seconds left. I wondered, Max, if I could just impose on you a bit of a final word, really. We've come to the end. Any big takeaways? I think one of the things we might want to do is reconvene. There's so many more questions, so many more issues to get really stuck into. Perhaps we can run this as a bit of a series, but for now, in just 60 seconds or so, any major takeaways around what we can do collectively to improve the situation in terms of responsible metrics?
Thank you. I think it's terrific to have this session. I really enjoyed the discussion, and some of the questions is great. We wish we had more time, but I think a takeaway for me is that, you know, everyone is saying that the same thing. We need to look away from the reliance on data alone in whatever purpose, you know, that we use data and metrics, but to develop a culture that is inclusive, that is supportive, positive, balanced the mission oriented sort of assessment with data insight. I think be it in ranking, governance, or hire and fire of staff, I think that is the basis for our community to come together, to really work together to advance what matters, truly matters in research, through building that kind of a culture. I think we heard so many very great insights on the best, you know, practice, and we should build a community of practice to really work together as founders, universities, rankers, and the whole community to start to turn the tide, to focus on the culture that will ultimately support the best minds in the world to tackle the challenges we have.
Excellent. Well, that's a very positive end, and I absolutely agree that we as rankers have a responsibility. Of course, companies like Clarivate have a responsibility, and of course, it will be led by the sector working together to ensure best practice. We will put this video online. We will have a write-up. We will have other mechanisms to keep these conversations going. I hope we can absolutely keep these conversations going and make sure we work together to do exactly as you say, Max, build that community of practice. But for now, a massive thank you to Vivek, to Lydia, to you, Max, and to Martin. Thank you very much indeed for giving your time and sharing your thoughts. And this is not the end of the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.